welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be participating in this evening's event, which I've been looking forward to all through the weekend. And I'd like to say thank you also to Deborah and Susan for helping with organising the event. It's wonderful to work in partnership with the AJR. The library and the AJR's partnership actually goes back many decades, to the 1940s even, and it's just wonderful that it continues through doing events like tonight's. So I'm especially looking forward to this event for three reasons that I just want to outline in introduction. I'm only going to speak briefly because I know how much we want to cover this evening. It's a fascinating story. There's three reasons really why I'm so excited to hear about it. The first of them is that we're talking tonight about an absolutely extraordinary individual who lived an extraordinary life, and his story has been forgotten for a long time, and undeservedly, and it's really thanks to the work of Paul Hooley, who is joining us tonight, that we're beginning to rediscover this story. And the subject of his two books is now much more widely accepted as having been a wrongfully forgotten hero of the 20th century. And through Paul's efforts, we are beginning to understand and remember and pay tribute to this hugely charismatic individual. And this is shown through things like the erection of a blue plaque in Wolfe Frank's memory, which went up 75 years after the Nuremberg Trials verdicts were handed down, and which were communicated by the chief interpreter at the trials, Wolfe Frank. And it's just, it's really important that we come to understand this life and we remember it, because it's not only fascinating, it's also hugely important, not least because the Nuremberg Trial International Military Tribunal was such a seminal event in the 20th century. But I think what's equally amazing, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it, was the fact that this story has happened really because of an incredible discovery of documents which Paul has painstakingly gone through and researched. And it would have been so easy for these documents to have been lost altogether. It was really, I'm not going to explain how this came to happen, but it was through really the recognition that and discovery of a set of documents by an individual called Mike Dillaway that meant that this story could be discovered. And the library sees this happen all the time, that there are such crucially important documents that are often in people's attics or hidden away, which are now coming to light and which absolutely deserve our attention. So that's another reason that I'm excited about tonight's event. And the last reason is that the library's own history is connected very closely to the history of the Nuremberg trials. The library was really the main source in Britain for crucial aspects of evidence gathering for the International Military Tribunal. So, for example, it was really the Wiener Library that provided a full record of the decrees, regulations and circulars of the Nazi regime, also anti-Semitic propaganda evidence dating back to the early 1930s and even the 1920s was provided by the Wiener Library to the Nuremberg trials. And that was acknowledged in various ways. And in fact, one of the library's staff members, Louis Bondy, actually was invited to visit Germany during the trials. And subsequently, after the trials, as a thank you for the library's contribution, a full copy of the transcripts of the trials was donated to the library, and those are actually still accessible for people who want to research the history of the Nuremberg trials today. So we're absolutely delighted that Paul's books are now being added to our collections, and I'm sure many people who are in the audience tonight will be keen to come to visit the library and read Paul's books. So I'll now turn over the floor to Paul himself, just as by means of introduction. Paul Hooley, MBE, was born and educated in Surrey. He's had a distinguished career himself with many different aspects, founding a printing company, director of a building society and private hospital. And since his retirement, he's devoted a great deal of time to studying history, especially aspects relating to military history. And so in certain ways, Paul was the absolutely perfect person to whom these documents are entrusted. And Paul, you've done a fantastic job creating these two books and bringing Wolfe Frank's story to light. So thank you very much on behalf of the AJR and the library for doing that, and we can't wait to hear more from you this evening. Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Toby, and a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. May I start by saying it's an honour to be able to give this talk to an audience that includes so many whose lives, families or heritage have been affected and shaped by the horrendous events covered in my books. First slide, please. I am at the same time pleased to have the opportunity to explain to you how, by chance, I came across a gem of a historical archive that had remained undisturbed in a Dorset attic for 25 years following the author's death, and the events that led me to produce these books based upon his life, times and memoirs. Next slide. That man was Wolfe Frank, the chief interpreter of the Nuremberg Trials of Nazi war criminals, whose contributions to freedom and justice were long overlooked, but who is now described, as Toby has said, as being a wrongfully forgotten hero of the 20th century. Frank clearly hoped his memoirs would one day be published, and they make for a gripping, absorbing and entertaining read, whilst at the same time forming a unique and important military and historical record that highlights the significant role interpreters in general, and Frank in particular, played throughout what many historians refer to as being the final battle of World War II. Next slide. Nuremberg's voice of doom is so called as this was the epithet that the world's media bestowed upon Frank following his announcing to the war criminals the verdicts and sentences of the court, pronouncements that were simultaneously listened to by a radio audience of several hundred million. Next slide. The books were launched at literary festivals in Mere, the Wiltshire town where Frank spent his final years and completed his manuscript. Although he had died 30 years earlier, there were people present who remembered him as being an imposing, charming and modest man of good taste and perfect manners, who was always impeccably dressed and who kept himself very much to himself. There was, however, so very much more to the man, for in spite of appearing to be the quintessential Englishman, he was in fact a refugee who had fled Nazi Germany in 1937 and was one of the last century's most courageous, complex and charismatic characters. Next slide. He had also been a strikingly handsome man and one of the great romantics of his age. He was married 5 times, including to a German baroness, an American actress and a suspected Russian spy, and had many other relationships. In short, this book has 2 interwoven themes, one of love, adventure and excitement, the other of a resistance worker's last escape from capture, his fight to become a British soldier, and his astonishing commitment to service, duty and justice. Next slide. Frank was a leading player at Nuremberg, and his contributions were seen to be scrupulously fair by judges, prosecutors, defence lawyers and war criminals alike, throughout what Norman Burkitt, one of those judges, described as being the greatest trial in history. Frank bequeathed his manuscript and other records to his close friend, as you've heard, Mike Dillaway, who, not realising quite what he had, consigned them to his attic, where they remained uninvestigated for over a quarter of a century. Next slide. About to move home in 2015, Mike asked me to look through the documents to see if there was anything of importance that should be saved and recorded. Initially, my heart sank, not just because of the sheer volume of papers, but because they were in no particular order. However, 12 months later, having sorted, catalogued, assessed, researched, and checked several thousand sheets of data, that same heart soared with excitement at the realization of the important discoveries I had made. This book is an expanded record of those discoveries and consists of a posthumous autobiography of the first half of Frank's life that stands up to close scrutiny, plus a potted biography of his later days based upon his memoirs and further information that I uncovered. Next slide. Originally named Johann Wolfgang, Frank later changed his forenames, firstly to Hans Wolfgang, then to Hugh Wolfe, the name under which he was granted British citizenship, but he always preferred to be known as Wolfe. He was born at Bierfeld in Saxony to a Jewish father and a Protestant mother on St. Valentine's Day 1913. Next slide. His father and grandfather before him were wealthy industrialists with factories in Bierfeld and Berlin, and this is a photograph of the Bierfeld factory. Next slide. Throughout his formative years, he lived here at Frank Villa, a spacious and impressive home that it is thought was designed by the renowned German architect Erich Mendelsohn. Next slide. His father, Ferdinand, had had carvings of Wolfe's two half-sisters, his daughters from a previous marriage, built into the fabric of the villa. This is the effigy of Ollie, one of those girls. Next slide. And here is Wolfe and Ollie in about 1915 in the garden of Frank Villa. Tragically, his other half-sister, Maria, and the girl's mother, Alice, perished in separate concentration camps. The beautiful Ollie, however, escaped capture, survived the war, and became a highly respected UNICEF ambassador. Frank's younger days were generally happy, and he enjoyed a comfortable and privileged lifestyle, clouded only by his father's strictness and infidelities. This eventually led to him running away from home and going underground in Berlin and Munich, where he admits to having become a Bavarian playboy. Next slide. However, two events in 1933 shattered his idyllic view of life and brought home to him the realities of the times. They also highlighted his own vulnerable position. Firstly, his father, who had by then lost his factories and knew as a Jew what lay ahead, took his own life. Next slide. The second event occurred on the 5th of March. Frank was present in Munich watching the Nazis' triumphal candlelit parade that announced Hitler's coming to power. During the rally, he witnessed what was almost certainly the first atrocity of the Third Reich. A middle-aged Jew standing in front of him was beaten to the ground simply for not giving the Nazi salute. This incident led Frank to resolve he would never again give the salute himself, and he managed to avoid doing so even on the many occasions he was in the same rooms as the Führer. Having seen what was happening to the Jewish community, including the confiscation of properties and goods, the beatings, the internments in ghettos and concentration camps, and the disappearance of friends and family, he became an active member of an underground resistance movement based at the Carlton Tea Rooms in Munich, where he and the Führer took their refreshment. Right under Hitler's nose, this group was involved in raising and smuggling large amounts of money and endangered Jewish citizens out of Germany. Next slide. In 1936, he met the woman who was to become his first wife, Baroness Medita von Skrabinski. The couple were unable to marry in Germany because of Frank's non-Aryan ancestry. However, whilst on holiday in Italy, they were befriended by a British Army officer, Major Humphrey Sykes, who arranged for them to come to England and be married from his home on the army base at Tidworth in Wiltshire. This is that home which is still used by the British Army to house officers and their families. Next slide. On his return to Germany a few days later, Frank was tipped off by a friend in the Gestapo that the authorities were onto him and that he was about to be arrested the following morning and interviewed in Dachau concentration camp. This was an appointment Frank decided he would not be keeping. Next slide. Branded an enemy of the state to be shot on sight, he escaped to Switzerland and eventually to England, leaving behind his bride of 6 days, whom he did not see again for almost 10 years. Arriving without money and few possessions, and unable to speak the language, he immediately began to integrate himself into the British way of life. Within 2 years, he was fluent in English, managing director of 2 companies, the producer of a West End musical, and was an executive with a land corporation of Cape Canaveral. Next slide. In 1938, he was advised to somehow formally disassociate himself from Germany. He did this by marching into the German embassy in London and insulting Hitler with a list of unprintable adjectives before spitting on a portrait of the Führer. Next slide. Shortly after, he received the notification he sought. He had been deprived of his German citizenship as an individual who was hostile to and an enemy of the National Socialist German Reich. Next slide. For a short while, life could not have been sweeter from Frank. He was officially stateless, fully established in England, an executive of several companies. He had a new luxury flat here in the apartments of London's exclusive Dolphin Square, was the tenant of a large property on the Thames, owned his own narrowboat, and had friends in high places. Next slide. He was also in a long-term relationship with a beautiful actress and dancer, Patricia Leonard, who was destined to become one of the richest women in the world. In spite of all this, his known heroism as a resistance worker and his having officially been declared an enemy of the Third Reich, at the outbreak of the war, along with most other former German and Austrian nationals, he was arrested and interned as an enemy alien. Next slide. Having lost everything he had worked for and furious at what the authorities had done to him, Frank was determined to clear his name, gain his freedom and join the British Army. Within weeks of detainment, he was appointed camp leader of nearly 2,000 men. And for the next several months, he applied pressure on the camp commanders, including Sir Timothy Eden, brother of then War Minister Sir Anthony Eden, who was later to become Prime Minister. Of particular interest to listeners of this broadcast is that Frank's final camp was at Peel on the Isle of Man, where the AJR is to shortly unveil a plaque in honour of internment. Those dark days, Frank records, I felt scared, mistreated, victimised and extremely angry. However, I also resolved that I would emerge undamaged and triumphant, in fact the victor, over all those injustices and those who created them. Both the principle and the methods used to intern those of us who had fled from Nazi terror will always remain one of the less glorious chapters in the history of a nation that is generally so very humane, but which can, at times, also be extremely cruel. Frank's persistence finally paid off, and he, together with 9 cohorts, were the first to be released from Peel. They were also permitted to enlist in the British Army's Pioneer Corps, about which he wrote, "Not one single case became known which might have justified the ill-advised caution. Men in some of the finest regiments in the British Army had earlier been classified as enemy aliens. Germans were running the risk of being taken prisoners by Germans. British medals were pinned on German chests." Next slide. Following 23 requests to be allowed to join a fighting unit, Frank was eventually transferred, firstly to the Royal Armoured Corps, and then in December 1944, having gained a commission, to the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, which he joined as a second lieutenant. During the remaining months of the war, he distinguished himself in a number of roles, and his linguistic skills came to the fore. especially whilst training Belgian soldiers in French how to use the Vickers machine gun. Next slide. Immediately following the Allies' victory in Europe, he was promoted captain and instructed to join the British War Crimes Executive, where he was informed this unit will be engaged in collecting material for the prosecution of major war criminals. That's Goering and others, you know. We leave on Sunday. Frank was therefore involved with the BWCA from day one of its operations, and he was given the first and at the time only piece of evidence to translate, Hitler's infamous Night and Fog Decree, which ordered the execution of Allied flyers, a scene featured in the film The Great Escape. The BWCA moved from London to Paris to Bad Oeynhausen near Hanover, where Frank honed his skills as a translator, investigator, and interrogator. He was soon seen to be an exceptional talent and was transferred onto the US translating team for the Nuremberg Trials. This eventually led to him being appointed chief interpreter. Prior to the start of the trials, he had broken all the non-fraternization rules by setting up a love nest for himself and his fellow officers within the British compound, where a hole had been cut in the fence to let the ladies in. Next slide. And in another astonishing move, he provided sanctuary in his own home to the former head of the Gestapo, Rudolf Diels, who had agreed to assist Frank gather evidence against the war criminals in return for immunity from prosecution, or at least a lenient sentence. Next slide. Frank wrote, "This was, of course, monumentally irregular and pleased me enormously, since breaking rules was, and still is, one of my favourite pastimes." Next slide. The Nuremberg trials were, of course, the military tribunals the Allies put in place to prosecute prominent members of the political, military, judicial, and economic leadership of Nazi Germany who had planned, carried out, or otherwise participated in the Holocaust and other war crimes. Next slide. They were held within the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg. Next slide. The first and most high profile of the trials were of those deemed to have been the major war criminals, and they were heard before what was officially termed as being the International Military Tribunal, the IMT. Held between November 1945 and October 1946, 24 of the most important leaders of the Third Reich were put on trial, including, next slide, Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated deputy and architect of the Holocaust. Next slide. Deputy Führer until 1941 and the third most powerful man in Nazi Germany, Rudolf Hess. Next slide. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, who was convicted for his role in starting the Second World War and enabling the Holocaust. Next slide. This is a layout of the court showing in red where the 8 judges sat, and in yellow, the seats of the war criminals. Adjacent to this, in the top left-hand corner, shown in blue, are the interpreters' booths. Next slide. Top left was the German desk, top right the French, bottom left the Russian, and bottom right the English. The trials were conducted predominantly in English and German, and Frank was the only interpreter whose skills were so good as to allow him to be used in either of the English or German booths. Next slide. Here are the Nazis listening to Frank, who can be seen circled top right, working in the German booth that day. Of the 24 on trial, 19 were found guilty, 3 were acquitted, 1 committed suicide prior to start, and 1 was found to be unfit to stand trial. Next slide. Following the conclusion of the IMT, the USA conducted a further 12 tribunals known as the subsequent proceedings. These trials were for war crimes committed by other Nazis who in many cases were no less evil than those convicted at the first trial. In total, almost 500 cases were tried at the subsequent proceedings involving over 1,600 defendants, of which 1,400 were found guilty. Frank was not only chief interpreter at these trials, he was also responsible for recruiting, appointing and training all the other interpreters and for arranging and organising every aspect concerning translations, including interrogations. Next slide. Here are a few images of what it was like behind the scenes. Firstly here, the rather Spartan conditions in which the interpreters and typists were asked to work. Next slide. The sheer volume of paperwork being generated. Next slide. And here is Frank following proceedings from an adjacent room before he went into court for an interpreting session. Unable to speak English in 1937, by the time of the trials, Frank was considered to be the finest interpreter in the world. He was also the leading pioneer of the process known as simultaneous interpretation, which in this context means the instantaneous oral reproduction of speech from one language to another. Peter Eberl, the chief German interpreter at the trials, records of the process, his origin. The system of simultaneous interpretation was crafted by trial and error in an attic room of the Palace of Justice, adding at the first, the very idea of multilingual instantaneous interpretation was unthinkable. The system, however, proved to be more successful than anyone had ever hoped, and the US Museum of World War II acknowledges the interpreters and translators were the unsung heroes at Nuremberg, and that without simultaneous interpretation, the trials would have been unviable. This is true. Had it not been for the introduction of simultaneous interpretation, every sentence would have required translating consecutively into 4 languages. It is generally accepted that the system reduced the duration of the IMT alone by over 3 years. Next slide. Of the innovation and Frank's performance, historians John and Ann Tusser record in their highly regarded account of the trial, the unanimous judgment on the simultaneous translation system was that it was a miracle like Pentecost. No one was ever unreasonable enough to expect all the translators to reach the standard of the ace of them all, Wolfe Frank, whose use of German and English was noticeably better than that of most native speakers. Next slide. Here is a close-up of some of the interpreters in action. Next slide. And here is a picture showing Frank circled in the English booth, translating the words of von Neurath, Hitler's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Once the trial started, Frank became a central figure in all stages. He interpreted the tribunal's opening remarks, which moves more than any other interpreter, and then finally brought proceedings to a close by informing the defendants of their fate. Next slide. It's true to say, therefore, that the first and last word the defendants heard at the trials were uttered by Wolfe Frank. Next slide. To put his contributions into context, he translated an estimated 1/3 of the 6 million words spoken at the IMT, including 9 of the 12 hours Hermann Goering, seen here, spent in the witness box. Next slide. Frank wrote, "We interpreters were involved in the writing of history and our contribution was of the greatest importance. None of the judges understood German, and everything said in that courtroom to them by the defendants and witnesses passed through the ears, brains, and mouths of we interpreters. Next slide. Some of Frank's most audacious bending of the rules concerned his encounters with Goering. On one occasion, he received a reprimand for speaking out of turn with Hitler's deputy. Frank had somehow arranged for his Great Dane to be given a pass to all areas of the Palace of Justice, with the exception of the courtroom itself. And he records, next slide. One day, when I stood near Goering in the courtroom, I heard him say to me out of the corner of his mouth, "I wish you'd feed me to that dog of yours instead of hanging me." Next slide. And I just had time to whisper back, "It won't work. He's fussy about his food," before a guard bore down on me to see if I'd broken the rule and talked to an accused. As an interrogator, Frank drew much vital evidence out of the war criminals, which was later used as evidence, including Bruno Tesch's confession to manufacturing and distributing the gas used in the extermination chambers. Next slide. And Otto Ollendorf's admission to humanely killing 90,000 Jews with his mobile gas chambers. Regarding his interrogation of Ollendorf, Frank records, "None of us could ever have imagined until that day such utter, total lack of moral, ethical, or human standards as we had witnessed. The man was proud, self-satisfied, and mentally at peace. Unlike all the other murderers, the henchmen, the executioners, the sadists, the monsters I had encountered, he was searching for no explanation, no excuse, no justification, because he saw it all in his outstanding services rendered to the cause. He did so to the end of his trial, quietly, accurately, and steadfastly, and I am certain he remained thus as he was walking up the steps to the gallows. There were days such as that when after my day in court, I could not eat, and I had to drown myself in alcohol before I could sleep." Next slide. On the evening before his performance as the voice of doom, Wolfe met and fell instantly in love with a touring American actress, Maxine Cooper, here seen in the arms of Ralph Meeker during the filming of Kiss Me Deadly. On the way to the courthouse the following morning, where he was to deliver the verdicts, he bet a colleague $500 that Maxine would become the second Mrs. Frank. Next slide. The couple were married in Nuremberg soon afterward. Next slide. Frank describes his announcing of the death sentences as being the tensest hour of his life. But even this was not without incident. As he was about to inform Goering of his fate, the sound equipment cut out, and Goering shrugged to indicate he could not hear what was being said. Once fixed, Frank resumed, and Goering gave him a thin smile and a thumbs up to indicate he could hear again. At the very moment, Frank announced, "Death by the rope." It was a moment frozen in time that haunted Frank for the rest of his life. Next slide. Here is how Goering had looked in his pomp, alongside what was possibly the last photo of him as he returned to his cell following Frank's announcement of the verdict. Next slide. Of those final moments, renowned Times columnist R.W. Cooper wrote, "Death by the rope." The words came to them in German through the headphones as each prisoner was brought up alone into the vast emptiness of the dock. They were uttered in translation by Captain Wolfe Frank, himself of German origin, who before departing from his country had watched the torchlight procession in Munich that hailed Hitler's coming to power. A strange turn of the wheel that he was now to utter the words that set the seal on Hitler's little day. Next slide. The Undercover Nazi Hunter is a sequel which chronicles a quite separate period of bravery and enterprise Frank undertook in 1949. Next slide. Alarmed at the misinformation coming out of post-war Germany and backed by the New York Herald Tribune, he returned to the country of his birth during the Cold War to make an undercover survey and to write an acclaimed series of articles under the generic title of Hangover After Hitler, which covered the main facets of post-war German life and viewpoints. During his mission, he sought and found objective answers to many leading questions concerning refugees, morality, denazification, religion, nationalism, and anti-Semitism, about which he wrote, "Before the war, there were about 600,000 persons of Jewish descent living in Germany. Today, there are 60,000. This means 540,000, more or less, were exiled or put to death." And he concluded with these words, "There is no less anti-Semitism in Germany than there was 10 years ago. The principal differences are there are fewer Jews against whom to direct it and occupation authorities who keep it from breaking out into violence." Next slide. Having been set the task of finding out what had happened to over 2,000 war criminals who had disappeared without trace, Frank tracked down and arrested Waldemar Woppenhans, the SS general, then ranked 4th on the Allies' most wanted list, before personally taking and transcribing his confession, of which only 2 copies were ever produced. One was handed into the Admiralty with the Nazi general and can no longer be found. The other copy remained hidden for 65 years in Frank's archive. The book includes Frank's series of articles as he wrote them, which shine a spotlight on dark corners, together with the full, unexpurgated Nazi Testament, which in its own right is a hugely important and revealing historical document that has never previously been seen in any language. It chronicles Woppenhan's life from childhood, growing up in the company of the Kaiser's sons, through his cadet days with Goering, to his involvement throughout World War I as an active leader in both the Army and the Air Force. It goes on to record his life between the wars, Heinrich Himmler and Goering, respectively vying for his services in the SS and the Luftwaffe, and his involvements throughout World War II as an Air Force commander, an SS Major General, a Lieutenant General of Police, and a battalion commander, variously in Germany, Austria, Poland, and the Ukraine, during which period he quelled rebel uprisings and stood accused, perhaps wrongly, of crimes against Jews. The testimony is eloquent, poignant, and concise, and clearly outlines the contrast between the atrocities carried out by the Nazis and the more honourable way German officers conducted themselves during the Great War. It also contains some hugely important revelations, including, next slide, the nickname Woppenhans and others gave to Hermann Goering at cadet school that may have been the catalyst that kindled in him the hatred that eventually led to him ordering a final solution to the Jewish question. And next slide. Himmler, seen 2 away from Woppenhans, who is circled, in the front row of this photograph of SS hierarchy, earmarking him to be the general who would head the SS in Great Britain if Germany won the war. Perhaps uniquely, Woppenhans served, often simultaneously and in positions of action and authority, in the Army, the Air Force, the SS, and the police. And in spite of him being one of the highest ranked SS officers, the confession and Frank's assessment suggests he was a courageous often honourable warrior. Awarded the Iron Cross First Class in both wars and the equivalent of 2 VCs, he had entered the conflicts on their very first days, and he was still in the thick of the fighting on the days that those wars came to an end. In March 1945, surrounded by General Bradley's 12th Army of 1.3 million men, and having, with a handful of comrades, taken out 3 US tanks in the Battle of the Ruhr with a bazooka, Woppenhans received his final instructions from the Third Reich. Next slide. I found there were orders for me to get through to Berlin. I was to let the Americans overrun that area, and I was to get out in civilian clothes. With Germany overwhelmed by Allied forces, Woppenhans donned his disguise, and although suffering from a badly damaged leg and heart problems, he began a 350-mile trek from the Ruhr to Berlin with the intent of helping Hitler defend what remained of the 1,000-year Reich before going down with the ship. Few, if any, servicemen from either side would be able to match the fortitude and service shown by this professional soldier, who was, perhaps until the publication of this book, the forgotten man of the Third Reich. Frank alone, it seems, decided his fate and saved his life, following which Woppenhans records, I have faced, oh, next slide, please. I have faced death often and even sought it once, but it was God's will that I should live to fill other tasks. I would have been hanged most certainly, as have many of my comrades, without reasonable justice, if I had been made a prisoner in 1945. Frank's personal war against the Nazis had therefore lasted from the 5th of March 1933, when he witnessed the first atrocity, until that day in December 1949, when he handed the German general over to the Admiralty. Of that moment, and on realising Woppenhans was no longer the threat he expected, Frank records, his face whitened and his hands shook as he dropped into a chair. I'd been prepared for a quite different reaction and felt a little silly about the small automatic I had handy in my pocket. He clasped his hands to his head and then muttered, God, I've kept it up for so long and now I'm caught. What will you do? Hand me over? It may therefore have been a peaceful surrender, but Frank wasn't to know that. And once again, he had single-handedly risked his life in bringing a high-ranking war criminal to justice. Next slide. Any listener to Frank's story thus far would be forgiven for thinking that such a man might consider his involvement at Nuremberg and his post-war undercover assignment to have been something extraordinary, and that the rest of his years might prove to be something of an anticlimax. However, whilst those events were undoubtedly highlights in a quite remarkable life, Frank viewed them as being no more than transitory events from which, once over, he quickly moved on, without much more than the occasional backward glance. To him, they were simply two of the challenges destiny had set him. In a talk like this, it's not possible to do more than skim the surface of some of his involvements. However, throughout a packed lifetime, he was also at various times an engineer, a financial advisor, racing driver, theatre impresario, broadcaster, journalist, salesman, businessman, restaurateur, skier, and property developer. All this and so much more is covered in these fascinating tales and important military records. As this terribly sad and moving, some will say noble way he chose to end his life. In summing him up, I would say he was a unique character of extreme contrasts. On the one hand, he spent a lifetime in the fast lane, thoroughly enjoying himself, even during the most difficult of times. It cannot be denied that he was a maverick who took liberties, a Lothario, a playboy, a risk taker, and he was an opportunist who liked nothing more than a challenge, even if that meant him risking his life. His other side, however, showed him to be a man of immense courage, charm, good manners, honour and ability. His handling of the translation's interrogations at Nuremberg sets him apart from all other interpreters of his time, perhaps of all time. He was asked to undertake the toughest of assignments imaginable, and he was perhaps the only man in the world who could have so satisfied all concerned. Next slide. After all he had experienced prior to and during World War II, Frank then endured a further 28 months of emotional anguish by being exposed daily to the utter degradation of fellow human beings and of witnessing the abominations and deprivation that had taken place in Nazi concentration camps. He then had the unenviable task of processing it all and explaining it in another language. One can only marvel at his ability to have been able to cope with such burdens. Yet his final comments also reveal his suffering, and it is little wonder he left the trials with the parting words, "I had heard enough about atrocities, mass murder, war crimes, extermination camps, and genocide. I'd been involved in the writing of a chapter of human history that would be read, talked about, and remembered forever. I'd been more totally and decisively immersed in the recording the horrors of the war than most of the millions who had fought in it. A lifetime is too short for such horrors to be filed away in the annals of history as something destined to be forgotten. As long as there are orphans who remember the extermination of their families, as long as there are men and women mentally or physically crippled by the faithful servants of Hitler's Third Reich, we should not afford ourselves the luxury of burying such ghastly memories." Frank achieved so much that was a benefit to so many in fighting the Nazis and in seeing that the perpetrators of evil received the justice they deserved. Yet he did it in a way that even the war criminals accepted as being scrupulously fair. In a newspaper article he gave in 1970, Frank explained, "Even Goering thought the trials were fair. I talked to him many times off the record. As far as the principle went, he refused to recognise our right to try him, the victor trying the vanquished. But even he agreed the court was incredibly fair." And Goering recorded as having said during the trials in October 1945, "Of course I want counsel, but it is even more important to have a good interpreter." He could have had only one person in mind when he made that remark. Next slide. I do not believe Frank was given the credit he deserved. Britain's two judges at Nuremberg, Geoffrey Lawrence and Norman Burkitt, and two leading prosecutors, Hartley Shawcross and David Maxwell Fyfe, were all raised to the peerage. Frank's contributions, however, seem to be overlooked, and he received no recognition. Yet he had matched, word for word, everything their lordships and everyone else had said and heard at the trials, from the most vulnerable of traumatized survivors of the Holocaust to the most arrogant of war criminals who had created it. Only Frank had done it in two languages at once and conveyed it all in a unique way, never previously attempted, that enabled every listener to fully and immediately understand the depth of victim suffering and the unbelievable cruelty of the perpetrators. R.W. Cooper sums up Frank's performances so well. His voice and manner, the nuances of his vocabulary, the ability to convey the character of the person for whom he was translating were all outstanding. And the chief German interpreter further emphasizes this point in his observation. Frank was the best. He could interpret just as deftly from German to English as the other way round, and was able to keep up with any speaker, no matter how fast. But for the discovery of Frank's archive, the world today would have been blissfully unaware of his story. However, I'm delighted to tell you that the publication of the books led Salisbury Civic Society to help put right what would have been the injustice of his achievements fading into obscurity. Next slide. On the 1st of October 2021, Frank received belated but permanent recognition when a Blue Plaque awarded by the Society was unveiled in his honour on the facade of his former home, the Malt House in Castle Street, Mere, here seen on the left. Amongst the large gathering were representatives of the British Army and the AJR, together with 3 proud generations of Wolfe's family and the present owners of the Malt House, Mr. and Mrs. Chalk. Next slide. Exactly 75 years earlier, on the 1st of October 1946, a worldwide radio audience of 400 million had listened as Frank informed the leading officers of the Third Reich of their fate. These were the final words of the final battle of World War II, and with them, Frank brought an end to the most evil regime the world has ever seen. Along with others, I am most grateful to Salisbury Civic Society for bringing about this lasting and fitting memorial. In so doing, the Society has helped ensure the deeds and services to his adoptive country and the free world of Wolfe Frank are appropriately recognised, and that he will no longer be a wrongfully forgotten hero of the 20th century. Next slide. For my part, having stumbled upon his archive, I knew it was my duty to ensure the important historical information became more widely known. My great hope is that I've done him justice, and I've told the Wolfe Frank story the way Wolfe Frank would have wanted it to be presented, warts and all. I hope too the historians, romantics and casual readers alike will see what I see, that once there was a very brave and dedicated man whose superlative scholarship, administration, intellect and integrity, to quote the Chief Counsel of War Crimes, won him the unreserved praise of all who were fortunate enough to witness his performances on a world stage, and that he was a major contributing factor in the undoubted success of the greatest trial the world has ever seen. Finally, Toby, I thank the Holocaust Library and yourself and the AGR for giving me this opportunity to tell the Wolfe Frank story, and the viewers for their patience in listening to this talk, which I hope they will have found to be interesting and informative. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was absolutely fascinating. It completely flew by, and I've got so many questions that I want to ask you. I do want to remind, though, everybody in the audience that if you have questions, please do put them in the chat, because we would love to pose your questions to Paul. So I'm going to actually start by asking a question about the epithet Nuremberg's voice of doom. I just wondered whether there are any recordings of Wolfe Frank's voice known to exist, because, I mean, of course, this was a person who spoke some of the most important words of the 20th century. I just wonder if we know what his voice sounded like.
I personally haven't heard them, but there are some that have come to light in recent times, which I'm told are stored at The Hague. And these are likely to be made available in the fullness of time. I believe also that somewhere in the archives of the BBC are recordings that they made. And also, and this is another astonishing fact about Wolfe, is that following his performances in court at Nuremberg, he often then either chaired or took part in radio programs in both English for the BBC and on German radio in German. It seems he was never free of this, of what I described earlier, throughout any of the 24 hours of the day. He lived and dreamt about it as well. So yes, they do exist, but as yet they haven't actually come to light. I'm hoping they will do in the near future.
Me too. I'd love to hear them, because you can get a bit of a sense from your presentation and the photographs of what this extraordinary person was like. And to enrich that even more by hearing the sound of his voice would be amazing, because it's a fascinating character that you've painted here, and it's so many contradictions, but also sort of common threads running through his life. And one of the things I found fascinating, you talked about him as a person full of contradictions in a way, that on the one hand, he's a person of deep seriousness and who acts out of principle, but on the other hand, he's sort of a fun-loving playboy who loves to break the rules. And I just wonder, as you've got to know Wolfe Frank more and more, how would you sum up his character?
Really, as a James Bond character, because all the things that I've told you there are what happened in court, but he was, as you saw, a very handsome man, and he was a romantic. Women seemed to find him irresistible, and they.
I was wondering why he didn't become an actor. Or he sort of because he's so handsome and he's sort of spent lots of time with actresses. He sort of seems like the sort of person that could easily have, I don't know, starred in a film or something.
Yes, he did move in those circles for a long while, and he describes some of his encounters very well, including Rock Hudson, for instance. Chatting up is the way he puts it, his then wife in front of him. And I think that stage that period in his life is something that one could go into on its own and come up with some very interesting answers. He was also, from time to time, involved in acting, although I haven't got very much information on that. I've got a couple of scripts he seems to have been sent. He was also a broadcaster, but he didn't seem to capitalise, as many would these days, on his fame. And quite literally on the circuits these days, he would be a superstar.
Mm. Well, you seem to have an extraordinary ability to, on the one hand, have a very kind of light-hearted attitude to life, sort of enjoying its pleasures, but also dealing with things, extremely disturbing things. He does seem to have been haunted by that to a certain extent. So I just sort of wonder, well, it just seems to me that that's a remarkable thing about him, that he was kind of able to live in multiple different worlds, I suppose.
Yes, and he seemed to be able to stand outside the horrors of the courtroom. And as I mentioned, even the war criminals themselves had a great deal of time for him. Albert Speer, for instance, who was Minister of Armament and War Production, he says that in the courtroom he only ever encountered hostile faces and icy dogmas, with the only exception of the interpreter's booth, from where I could expect a friendly nod. And Speer actually asked during the trial if he could have a private conversation with Frank, which the judges allowed him to do, and they spent about an hour in the court just talking. They never once mentioned the trial itself, but they were keen skiers, and Frank even agreed that he would meet Speer, who was given 20 years, when he came out of prison on one of his ski chateaus in the Alps. It never took place, but he was also able to bring points out of his interrogations, as I said, which were later used in evidence against some of the war criminals. And for instance, Keitel exploded in Frank's cross-examination of him and said that he was standing next to Hitler when the assassination attempt, when the bomb went off, and he would have given anything to have died alongside his Führer at that time. And Kaltenbrunner, this would probably never have come out, but he was the highest ranked SS officer on trial at Nuremberg, and he signed all the orders for concentration camps. But he told Frank that it was in fact a rubber stamp facsimile, which he had no knowledge of. And then following this, when Frank started talking to him about his own family, he openly wept in front of him. There was also Robert Lay, who was another who committed suicide before the trial started. But he actually tried to persuade Frank to find him a Jewish lawyer to represent him at the trials. But of course, it was never needed. He never got that far. It's
extraordinary because, on the one hand, as you say, Wolfe Frank is playing a crucial part in bringing out these details that made, I suppose, the reckoning of Nuremberg possible, and also, as you said, made it possible to do it in relatively short order, which was crucial for concluding the first trial, the International Military Tribunal. Within less than a year, and that was crucial because, of course, it wasn't that long before the kind of cooperation of the Allies sort of ended. So, you can't underestimate the crucial contribution that Wolfe Frank is making. But there's also kind of a feeling of it being at times too close for comfort. That in some ways, I wonder whether he might have felt compromised in some ways by being so close. And needing to see things from both sides with horrendous war criminals like Goering, where it's hard for any of us instinctively, emotionally, not to see things in black and white, good and evil. But for an interpreter, you have to, I suppose, get too close for comfort. And I just wonder if there's any sign that Wolfe Frank felt uncomfortable about some of the things that he had to do.
I would say no, Toby. He seemed to be comfortable in any situation, and he seemed to be able to handle it, and he seemed to be able to merge with or mingle with any level of society. For instance, in during his writing of the articles as the undercover Nazi hunter, he was able at times to become an aristocrat in both England and Germany, and pass for one at any level. He was also able to become a refugee or to blend in with any other section of society. If he needed to wear Bavarian clothes, he looked like a Bavarian. If he needed to look like an English lord, he looked like an English lord, and he would have passed for one. He really was a quite exceptional character.
So many details from the book illustrate that. This story of the Great Dane, he got that dog off a kind of an American officer. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, and you almost have to imagine, the charm with which he was going around the Nuremberg Palace with this dog. I don't know. He's such an intriguing character who, as you say, seems to have been comfortable in almost any situation.
Yes, and the dog you mentioned actually became the subject of a 3-page article in the New Yorker. It had become so famous itself around Nuremberg, and Frank obviously as the owner. And whenever he was due into court, he would just push this dog into the nearest room, which was usually 606. The shot I showed you of where he was listening to the trial, because he was always very well prepared, and he would sit in on the trial long before he had to go in and do his piece as an interpreter to ensure that he was following proceedings right up until the last moment. The dog almost became as famous as he was, especially after the New Yorker article.
Fascinating. So I'm going to take a question from the audience now, actually. So one audience member is wondering, when you were going through these documents, was there a particular fact or something that a moment of discovery that you remember from that process? What was the kind of, did you ever have any eureka moments or just a kind of jaw-dropping moment when you were going through that material?
I think there were so many. I used to write a chapter once I'd got it all sorted, which took a long while. I used to write a chapter perhaps every 2 or 3 days, and every time I came up with something that, as you've just said, would be jaw-dropping to most of us, but which he seems to take in his stride. And I would take a chapter down to my wife to read, and she was longing for the next one. And so many people have said this, because I've also written the books in a way that tells the story as well as gives all the facts that one would need to know and all the background information. So it is a tale. And she and others have said they found it very difficult to put down and look forward to the next chapter because of his astonishing achievements and lifestyle. I could go into so many, Toby, but I will also tell you that what I've produced is about 1/3 of his documents. There probably is another book in there at some time or other.
Well, actually, another question from the audience, which is, has anyone shown any interest in making a film? Because it does seem like it's such a compelling story that it almost seems to lend itself to a film, and you'd have to cast quite a handsome lead man as well.
Yes, yes to both answers. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we had been approached by several film companies, and one was, we were actually going through a contract as the pandemic hit. But it hit the entertainment industry so badly that almost everything came to a stop, and nothing really has moved on since then. But as so many readers have said, and in the kind comments that they've posted following their recommendations, it would make a wonderful film. And also, unlike so many other films where the real character would have trouble living up to the looks and personality of the person that they're portraying, it almost be the other way around here. And it would be almost difficult to, well, it would be difficult to perhaps find someone who could look and sound and behave as Wolfe Frank did.
Right, absolutely. So I think that's, I really hope that we will see the story on our screens before too long. So I had a question actually also from the audience about Wolfe Frank's interpreting, and in particular, just saying how unusual it is to interpret both to and from a language, commenting that Wolfe Frank must have been an incredible linguist, which seems certainly to have been the case. So I'm interested in I suppose whether there's more out there in terms of what Wolfe Frank did in interpreting. Will there be more written about this, do you think? And also, in terms of the language skills that Wolfe Frank exhibited, are there signs from before he left Germany that he exhibited unusual skill in languages?
No, not quite right. He could speak French and Italian and a spattering of Russian, but he says when he arrived in England, he had no English to talk of at all. But it just seems he had that ability, as many linguists have, that it's almost a second nature to them, and they can pick it up so easily. But if I could just read you a couple of of quotes, from those involved. One of the judges, Wolfe Frank, ace interpreter at the Nuremberg war crimes, and as far as I'm concerned, the whole world round, a prosecutor. Frank's translations were delicious. He had a great command of the English language. I used to go to the courtroom sometimes in the afternoons just to listen to him. And a newspaper's view, Wolfe Frank, ex-German and ex-British officer, was chief interpreter for 2 years at Nuremberg, materially contributed to the practical success of those enormously difficult procedures. He won the unreserved praise and tributes of the American and British jurists. And as I said earlier, a historian's view, which I think sums it up, the unanimous judgment of the simultaneous translation system was that it was like Pentecost. No one was ever unreasonable enough to expect all the translators to reach the standard of the ace of them all, Wolfe Frank. And that's just 2 or 3 of different people viewing Wolfe Frank's efforts on behalf, or should I say, from different viewpoints within the court. And his ultimate superior officer said at the end of it all, Wolfe Frank's performance was most excellent, and indeed may be described as brilliant. He is an outstanding expert in not only simultaneous interpretation, but in the selection and training of interpreters for this very difficult work. Now, I think that's another point. The simultaneous interpretation had never been tried before, and yet he not only mastered it, he was able to pass it on to so many others. Well, obviously, there were many others within the court at the time who were very, very good. I liken it to perhaps something like the Barcelona football team of a few years ago, who had gathered together the very best players from all over the world. But there was one player in there, Lionel Messi, who, even though he was amongst the greats, still stood out and was able to lead. And I think that's the role that Frank played. And then, following the IMT, in the subsequent proceedings, he went on to select, and he went on television. He was with Richard Dimbleby, seeking interpreters with the qualities and standards that he knew was required. And once he'd found those people, he then trained them in his own way and brought the proceedings to the conclusions that they were, which everybody has agreed was a huge success that was unviable but for the simultaneous interpretation that was introduced at Nuremberg.
Fascinating, thank you, Paul. So we, as we normally try to keep our events close to an hour when we're doing Zoom, we are running short on time, but I didn't want to finish without asking a question about Wolfe Frank's later life. We've had some interest in the chat about whether you mentioned Wolfe Frank's multiple marriages. There's some questions around his family and children, and then there's also some broader questions about Wolfe Frank's later life and why he chose Meer as a place of residence, for example.
Yes, taking the last one first. It could well have been that Meer was chosen by accident, or he ended up there by accident. On the other hand, he was still working for the European Union as a translator, and he needed transport or good communications to London. Now, Meer is just off the A303, which is very handy for Heathrow Airport, and it also a very good train service to London. But it's also been suggested to me, I mean, amongst other things that Wolfe did, he was a very good chef and a restaurateur, and then he had businesses in Italy, Spain, and Andorra during his life. That it might have been that he was thinking of setting up a restaurant in Mir, as well as, or perhaps to take over from the time that he would no longer be able to travel to Europe to do the translations for the European Union. With his marriages, he didn't wish to say anything very much about those, and I have met some of them, and they're absolutely delightful people. And with respect for both them and him, there's nothing else that I would want to add to that.
Right.
Regarding his demise, as I mentioned, it was a very sad episode. Wolfe had fallen on hard times towards the end of his life. He was living on his own, and he had some unfortunate experiences in his business life, which he had lost much of his money as well. He was also suffering from Parkinson's disease and glaucoma, and in conversations with Mike Dillaway, he indicated that he was finding it very difficult to cope with. And then one day he visited Mike, who did a lot of work on Wolfe's car. Mike was a panel beater, and Wolfe was having some problems with a few little accidents he was having. So Mike was a regular visitor to Wolfe's house, and the other way around. And he arrived one day and said that he'd like to borrow a roll of masking tape. And when Mike asked him what it was for, he said, "Well, if anyone asks, tell them I'm doing some decorating." And then he went home, and he dressed himself in his finest clothes, and he went to his favourite restaurant, which was the Old Ship in Mir, which abutted his former home. And he had a very fine meal, which he washed down with a bottle of champagne. And then he got in his car and drove into the night. And the following morning, Mike, who, a very unfortunate coincidence, was the local garage service for dealing with abandoned cars, etc., was visited by the police, and he was asked to go and remove a car on the outskirts of Mir, which had been found with a man in it with the window sealed with masking tape. And Mike didn't need to know, didn't need to ask who the car belonged to or what the registration number was. And that was the very last, obviously, experience that anyone had. And on the seat of the car was Wolfe's last will and testament, in which he indicated that he was leaving everything to Mike Dillaway, who I have to say as well was a very great friend to Wolfe at a time when he needed one most. And Mike not only dealt with Wolfe's affairs after he died, but saw to it that he had a proper funeral. And I've learned afterwards that Wolfe's ashes were taken to Davos, his favourite ski resort, where he lived and spent a lot of his life, and were buried in the place that he'd asked them to be buried.
Well, I can only say that having heard that, I'm all the more pleased that that this story is now being properly heard by many more people, and also that initiatives like the Blue Plaque initiative have taken place. And that must have been a very special moment for you, Paul, to see that plaque erected.
It was indeed, Toby. And I'm very grateful to Salisbury Civic Society for thinking Wolfe worthy of that award. And it is the only plaque that they've actually awarded outside the greater city limits. So that's another reason why it stands out amongst many plaques in our area.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating, important history with us this evening, Paul. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you. So on behalf of the Association of Jewish Refugees, the Wiener Holocaust Library, and our audience here this evening, I'd like to say thank you for coming along and speaking to us.
Well, thank you very much, Toby.
I can see lots of people applauding from the audience, so I think this is an excellent moment to just sum up and say farewell to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Good night.